Not silent, there was always some low-level sound. Papers shuffling. A chair scraping. The distant hum of the building's ventilation. But it had the particular quality of quiet that formal spaces carry. The kind of quiet that asks people to behave like the moment matters. Judge Carol Pearson had presided over this courtroom for 11 years. She had sat behind that bench through hundreds of cases, thefts, assaults, drug offenses, domestic disputes, fraud. She had heard testimony that made her angry and testimony that broke her heart and testimony she didn't believe a word of. She had learned, over those 11 years, to maintain a steady face regardless of what was happening inside her. Composure was not just a professional habit. It was a form of respect. The people in her courtroom, defendants, victims, witnesses, attorneys, all deserved a judge who could hold the room. She was good at holding the room. On a Tuesday morning in October, a routine drug possession and theft case was called up. The defendant was being brought in from the holding area. Carol looked down at the paperwork. She reviewed the name. The age. Then the side door opened and the defendant walked in. Carol looked up. And for the first time in 11 years behind that bench, she could not hold the room. She recessed the court, stood up, and walked out. Carol Pearson had grown up in Colorado Springs. The second of 3 children. Her father was a high school history teacher. Her mother ran a small alterations business from their home. They were not wealthy, but they were stable, a word Carol had come to understand, as an adult, was more valuable than it sounded. She had known from an early age that she wanted to be in a room where fairness was the point. Where the rules were clear and the outcome was supposed to be just. She had studied pre-law at the University of Colorado, gone to law school in Denver, clerked for a circuit judge, worked as a prosecutor for 8 years, and then applied for the bench. She had been 41 when she was first appointed. Her husband, Thomas, had taken a photograph of her in her robe before her first day. She kept it on her desk at home. She had 2 sons. David was 22 and in graduate school in Oregon. Younger than David by 3 years was Michael. Michael was 19 years old. He had been a difficult teenager, not in the dramatic way, but in the quiet, drifting way that was sometimes harder to address. He had struggled in school. He had found the wrong group of friends at 16. There had been a period of marijuana use that Carol and Thomas had addressed firmly and, they believed, successfully. Then Michael had moved out at 18. He said he needed space. He got an apartment with 2 friends. He got a job at a warehouse. Carol called him every week. He answered about half the time. She had been telling herself he was finding his way. The man who had walked through that courtroom door was her son. She stood in the corridor outside the courtroom with her back against the wall and her robe still on and her hands pressed flat against the painted concrete. Her clerk, a young woman named Beth, had followed her out. "Judge Pearson? Are you all right?" Carol looked at her. She needed 10 seconds. She used them. "I need you to pull the case file for the defendant who just came in. The one we were about to hear." She kept her voice even. "Look at the address on the intake form. And I need you to contact the court coordinator and tell them I have a conflict. We need to reassign this case to another judge immediately." Beth stared at her for a moment. "Of course. Is everything okay?" "Please do it now," Carol said. "Thank you." Beth moved quickly down the corridor. Carol stood for another moment. She took a breath. She thought about Thomas, who was at work. She thought about the right sequence of things to do, and in what order. She was, even here, even now, a person who thought in sequences. It was how she processed. First, recusal. Done. Second, notify the court coordinator. In progress. Third, tell Thomas. Needed. Fourth, understand what had happened. She didn't know the full shape of the charges yet. She had seen the name and the face and her mind had stopped processing the paperwork after that. Drug possession. Theft. Those had been the categories on the brief. She pulled out her phone. She called Thomas. He answered on the second ring. "It's Michael," she said. The case was reassigned to Judge Harold Winters within the hour. Carol recused herself fully and formally, citing a personal conflict of interest. She gave no further details because no further details were required. The law was clear on judicial recusal. It was not a failure. It was the system working exactly as it should. But knowing that didn't make the afternoon easier. She completed the rest of her scheduled hearings on autopilot, a word she would have resisted applying to her work on any other day. She was present and professional and nobody in those rooms would have detected anything different about her. But underneath the composure, something was happening that required the rest of her capacity. Thomas left work at noon and drove to the courthouse. He waited in her office. When she came in after her last hearing, he stood up. He was a steady man, a civil engineer, methodical, not prone to crisis. He looked at her and didn't say anything for a moment. She sat down across from him. "Tell me what you know," she said. He had spent the morning making calls. He told her what he had found. Michael had been arrested 2 days ago. The charges were possession of a controlled substance and shoplifting, the latter from a pharmacy. He had been held in county lockup while awaiting his hearing. He had not called them. He had not contacted them at all. Carol sat with that last part. He had been in a cell for 2 days and had not called his parents. She wasn't sure what to do with that information. It sat in her chest and pushed. "We need to get him a lawyer," she said finally. "I've already called one," Thomas said. The lawyer's name was Paul Garrett. He was experienced, direct, and took the meeting with Carol and Thomas that same evening. He told them what he knew. Michael had been picked up outside a pharmacy in the 5 Points neighborhood. He had a small amount of methamphetamine on him. He had shoplifted a meal from inside the pharmacy, food, nothing expensive. He had not resisted arrest. He had not said much to the arresting officers. "What does this tell you?" Thomas asked. Paul chose his words carefully. "The meth charge is the concern. The shoplifting suggests he may have been in a difficult financial position. These two things together, combined with his age, suggest to me that your son is not a criminal by nature. He's a young man who has developed a problem and whose circumstances deteriorated as a result." Carol was quiet for a moment. "What is he facing?" Paul gave her the honest version. With no prior record, a first-time drug charge could go several directions. If handled well, and he intended to handle it well, Michael could be eligible for a diversion program rather than incarceration. Treatment, supervision, community service. It would depend on the judge and on Michael's cooperation. "He has to want to cooperate," Carol said. "Yes," Paul said. "He does." Carol looked at her hands. She had sat across from defendants for 11 years. She had heard lawyers say the same things Paul was saying now, about circumstances, about potential, about the difference between who a person was and what a person had done. She had always believed those things. Intellectually. She had never before understood what it felt like to hear them said about your child. She saw Michael for the first time the following day. Thomas came with her. They sat in a visitation room, the kind with a table and plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale. Michael was brought in by a corrections officer and seated across from them. He looked at his father first. Then at his mother. He looked younger than 19, which surprised her. He also looked ashamed, not performing shame, the way some people do, but carrying it in his body the way something heavy is carried. "Mom," he said. And then he stopped. "Don't," she said quietly. Not unkindly. Don't apologize yet. I need to understand first. She asked him questions. Careful, direct questions. The same kind she asked in her courtroom, because it was the only language she had for this. He answered them. The story came out in pieces. He had lost his warehouse job 7 months ago when the company downsized. He hadn't told them. He'd been getting by on savings, then not getting by. A roommate had introduced him to meth at a party. He'd told himself it was once, then occasional, then he'd stopped telling himself anything and just used when he needed to feel less bad. Why didn't you call us? Thomas asked. Michael looked at the table. Because of who you are, he said quietly. Both of you. I didn't want, I thought if I called you, I'd have to say it out loud. And then it would be real. Carol looked at her son. She thought about all the times she had read case files and understood the person in them as a category rather than a life. She felt something shift in her that she hadn't expected. Paul Garrett was skilled and thorough. He filed motions, gathered documentation, and built a case for diversion eligibility. He presented Michael's lack of prior record, his age, and a letter from Michael himself, written with Paul's guidance but in Michael's own words, acknowledging the offense and expressing genuine intent to seek treatment. Michael's case was heard 3 weeks after the original date. Carol did not attend. She could not, it would have been inappropriate, regardless of recusal. She sat at home that morning and did what she never did, she waited. She sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and she let the minutes pass without trying to fill them. Thomas texted her from outside the courtroom as each development occurred. Judge Winters on the bench now. Paul speaking. Michael speaking. That last one made her close her eyes for a moment. She had been in courtrooms when defendants addressed the court. She knew the weight of that moment, the moment when a person had to stand and say something true about themselves in a room full of strangers, with something significant at stake. She knew how hard it was. She thought about her son standing in that room. Ruling in 15 minutes, Thomas texted. She put the phone down and stood at the kitchen window and watched 2 birds land on the fence and fly away. Then, diversion approved. Treatment program. Supervision. No incarceration. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. Or not exactly. It was something adjacent to crying, the physical expression of pressure releasing from a place that had been holding it for 3 weeks. Michael came home for dinner the night after the ruling. Not to move back in, his apartment was still his independence still real. But Carol had asked if he would come for dinner, and he had said yes. She made pasta. It was his favorite from childhood. She stood at the stove and made it carefully and tried not to assign too much meaning to the act of cooking for her son, which she recognized she was doing anyway. Thomas set the table. They didn't speak much while they prepared. They had talked through most of what needed to be said over the past 3 weeks. What remained now was something that words weren't quite the right tool for. Michael arrived at 6. He had showered and his hair was clean and he looked more present than he had in the visitation room, more there, somehow, less submerged. They ate. They talked about small things first. The food. A project Thomas was working on. A news item that none of them had strong opinions about. The ordinary conversation of people feeling their way back toward each other across a distance that had formed quietly over time. Then Michael set down his fork. I need to say something, he said. Carol and Thomas looked at him. I know I scared you, he said. I know this whole thing, the arrest, the courtroom, all of it, I know what that cost you. Both of you. He paused. I didn't call you because I was ashamed. But I think I didn't believe you'd still want to help. I thought you'd look at what I'd become and decide I wasn't worth the effort. He looked at his mother specifically when he said the last part. Carol put down her fork. Michael, she said. You have never, not once, not for a single moment, been not worth the effort. The treatment program was 12 weeks. Michael entered it the week after the dinner. He lived in a residential facility for the first month, then transitioned to outpatient sessions while returning to his apartment. Carol and Thomas were not involved in the day-to-day of it, that was appropriate, and the counselors made clear that Michael's recovery belonged to Michael. Their role was to be available when he reached toward them. He reached more than Carol had expected. He called on Sunday evenings. Not every Sunday, sometimes he missed one. But most weeks, her phone rang. He talked about how the program worked, about the things he was learning, about the small decisions each day that were harder than they looked from the outside. She listened. She did not offer solutions. She had learned, from her work, from Thomas, from the counselor who ran a family information session she attended, that listening was its own form of help. She returned to her courtroom the week after Michael entered treatment. She sat behind the bench and looked at the room and the people in it, and she was the same judge she had always been in terms of process and procedure and her commitment to fairness. But she was not the same person. She had always believed that defendants were human beings whose stories extended beyond the charges on the paperwork. She had always tried to hold that belief. Now she held it differently. More fully. From the inside. Michael completed the program in early spring. He got a new job, at a small landscaping company, outdoor work, physical, uncomplicated in the ways he needed things to be uncomplicated for a while. He was good at it. He came home on Sundays still with dirt under his fingernails and the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who had worked hard with their body. He was not fixed in the sense of being finished. Recovery doesn't work that way. He still had hard days. He still had the weight of what that period had cost him, financially, relationally, in terms of lost time and altered trust. That didn't disappear. But he was present. He was trying. He was, in the most basic and important sense, still there. Carol went back to her work. The cases continued. The courtroom was the same room, same walls, same bench, same fluorescent light at a slight angle that she had been meaning to report as a maintenance issue for 3 years. But she began doing one thing differently. When she had discretion in a ruling, when the law gave her room to choose between outcomes, she used that room more deliberately than before. She had always considered context. Now she considered it more fully. Not in a way that compromised fairness. In a way that honored it. A young man brought before her on a first-time drug charge, no priors, clear signs of underlying instability. She asked him questions that weren't strictly required. She listened to his answers. She gave him the same opportunity a judge had given her son. After court that day, her clerk Beth stopped her in the corridor. "You've been different this year," Beth said. Not critically. Observationally. Different how? Carol asked. Beth thought about it. Warmer, she said. Still completely fair. But like you understand something now that you didn't before. Carol considered that for a moment. I do, she said. She didn't explain further. She walked to her office and sat at her desk and looked at the photograph of herself on her first day, young, robed, holding everything together. Then she looked at the more recent photograph she had added beside it. Dinner at home. Thomas. Michael. Her. 3 people at a table, in ordinary light, just eating. The cases were important. The law was important. The fairness she worked to uphold every day, that mattered deeply. But this was what the work was for. People finding their way back to each other. That was the whole thing.